Glad you could join us on Nigeria Beyond 2023. My name is Yemisi Lanre Ido. Now, Nigeria Beyond 2023 is an economic chopping board of the agenda of every presidential candidate. And so we continue with the conversation, and this time we're having presidential candidates of the All Progressives Congress. Bola Ahmed Tinubu is a third Republic Senator, two-term governor of Lagos State, and one of the major chieftains of the party. He has promised to give Nigeria renewed hope in governance and economic stability. He's promised, amongst other things as well, to phase out the fuel subsidy, but yet maintain the underlying social contract between government and the people. He's also promised to introduce a Nigeria First policy by which gas resources shall be directed as a priority to Nigerian power generation, as well as to increase domestic crude oil production to 2.6 million barrels per day by 2027. On the chopping board today, I'll be joined by the Director, Impact Research and Chief Economist, Proshare, Teslim Shitta-bey. Also joining me is the member of All Progressives Congress Party APC 2023 Presidential Campaign Policy Team and an economist, Dr. Tope Fasua. Joining me virtually also is a public affairs analyst and CEO of Dairy Hills, Kelvin Emmanuel. Let's get down to it. Well, joining me on today's edition of Nigeria Beyond 2023 is the Director, Impact Research and Chief Economist, Proshare, Teslim Shitta-bey is with me in the studio. Many thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining me virtually is the Public Affairs Analyst and Chief Executive Officer of Dairy Hills, Kelvin Emmanuel. Thank you for joining us, Kelvin.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And a member of the All Progressives Congress Party 2023 Presidential Campaign Policy Team and an economist as well, Dr. Tope Fasua. Many thanks for your time, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
All right, let's go straight to the point. And I'm starting with the monetary policy and the plans of your candidate for the monetary policy. And he says that his administration, if elected, will work with several agencies or relevant agencies, the central bank, financial sector, to carefully review and better optimize the exchange rate regime. I'm starting with this, looking at what's happening in the system, talking about reality. Now, how best does he want to achieve this? How best does he want to optimize the monetary policy, working with these relevant agencies that he has talked about?
I think there's an ongoing argument or discussion around the monetary policy, especially the naira value vis-a-vis the dollar, especially. And what has been promised is basically a more hands-on approach in terms of resolving some of the issues around the value of the naira and so on and so forth. Essentially, the big question is, we talk about we want a single rate in the market. But I think what that also belies, when we ask for a single rate, is we are assuming, I think what we should be asking for is to understand that the rates will always be dynamic and they will always move. However, I think what the candidate has promised is a scenario where we would not have a different rate for people in the villa, a different rate for the civil service, a different rate for education abroad, a different rate for customs, a different rate for imports, and so on and so forth. So, however, the mistake many people make is to try to benchmark with the parallel market. The APC candidate has not promised to equate the rate with what's called the black market as a fact. The black market is what it is. It is a black market. It is indeed an illegal market. Every country has a black market for everything. And those who approach the black market in any country know that they are going to approach a dangerous market. Now, that market in Nigeria for foreign exchange, unfortunately, for several reasons, has become the main market where most people approach without any fear, because it is believed that that's the real market and so on. However, what must be said is that that market, number one, is thin. It's not as robust or in terms of volume as the official market. But we've seen a bit of prevarication on the part of several governments in the past, whereby we keep all these multiple rates. I think that the commitment is that the I&E window, which is the investors and exporters window, which is being practiced right now, will remain. And that window is very dynamic. It is traded on a per second basis, and people can take their rate from it. Number one. Number two is to understand that you will never get a particular single rate in every market. There will be, what I think we should begin to sensitize Nigeria on, is that there will be slight variation, plus or minus, a certain small percentage between one market or the other. Even in, for example, you want to buy PTA, if, for example, you want to buy from the bank, even if it was possible to buy from the BDC, or you want to sell your dollar cash to a BDC, Bureau de Change, official Bureau de Change, you should expect that you may get 1 naira or 2 naira less from one Bureau de Change to another Bureau de Change, and also that the rates may also be different in the bank.
All right, let me come in here.
Ability and what have you. So I think that, yeah, okay.
Let me come in here. You talked about single rate. You talked about dynamism and what the CBN is doing with the I&E window. Well, let's call a spade a spade. Your president, if he comes into power, wants to optimize the system. But how does he do this if he does not? No, let me come to the economist in the studio. I'll come back to you. You would share your thoughts. But let me come to you, Mr. Shitta-bey. How does he do this if he does not take out the parallel markets?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. The first thing I want to point out is what Dr. Fasua has said. You are more likely to get a single rate. You will get variations on a certain rate. And market dynamism means so much that there is a freedom to supply the market, just as there's a freedom to request for currency. So there's a demand and supply equilibrium. Now, what normally happens is that exporters bring their foreign exchange into the system, and of course they can freely sell it at whatever price they feel is the market can carry. In Nigeria, what we've done is to create multiple exchange rates officially. We've created multiple exchange rates and created opportunity for what the economists, perhaps for want of a better word, calls arbitrage. In other words, you can buy in one market and sell in another market at a profit. Now, what I think is the key issue here is that, do we want to be market determined, or do we want to be regulation determined? Do we want the market to dictate what the price of currency is, or do we want to manage that price officially? Now, I think wisdom lies in between. Allowing the market to freely determine what the exchange rate is could cause a lot of disruption to the economy. The naira could perhaps, for instance, collapse to 1,000 plus, and that will have feed-on effects in domestic inflation rate. It will have consequences for interest rates, because once inflation spikes, you see the central bank pushing up monetary policy rates. So the rate at which businesses can borrow also spikes. And so what does the manufacturer do? What does the service sector man do? What he does is just decide to reduce staff. So unemployment rate also goes, and we don't want to go through that dark and very agonizing hole. So what do we do? The APC seems to suggest, and I'm not speaking on their behalf, that they're going to remove some of those barriers to the various access to foreign exchange. In other words, rather than having...
What barriers are we talking about?
Now, the barriers are like thresholds. These are different thresholds for different classes or people who want access to foreign exchange. Now, if I want access to foreign exchange for education, I have a rate. So there's a threshold. If I want access to foreign exchange for for instance, to buy raw materials. There's a threshold. And it's mind-boggling. You now have to borrow, you now have to go mentally to decide, okay, what rate is applicable to what particular transaction. However, the way other markets work is that there's free people come in, you can sell your foreign exchange at whatever rate you think is better, and people can buy at that rate. And if your rate is too high, go to another person.
But unfortunately, we can't eat our cake and have it, because it looks like Nigeria is market-driven, market-determined, and also self-regulated.
I like the word look like.
It looks like that. Okay, you talked about those that need the BTAs and the PTAs, but the reality on ground is that if we go to the bank, they don't get it easily. They don't have access to these funds, FX, easily. So let me come to you, Mr. Kelvin. What policies do you think that this government is not putting in place right to get these things right, especially when it comes to these dynamism and multi-markets that we have on ground?
You have to change the exchange rate model, and you have to create liquidity for the FX markets. What are the four major sources of FX for the central bank? Number one, you have trade finance, or what you typically call your NXP proceeds. Number two, you have your diaspora remittances, which the World Bank says last year was $21 billion US. Number three, you have your oil receipts. And then number four, you have your foreign direct investment, both your speculative FPIs and non-speculative foreign direct investments. Now, what do we have today? There's only one viable source, which is diaspora remittances. The ROT 200 program CBN launched, in my opinion, is a failure. And the reason it's a failure is because you can't use the $190 million to incentivize $9.8 billion in inflows. It doesn't make any sense. And you see, you can't have companies bring in their FX and lose 300 Naira per USD and tell them that you incentivize them with 65 Naira per USD when they're losing net of 235 Naira per USD. Doesn't make any sense. What are the issues with oil receipts? It says, same central bank says that between 2014 and 2023, oil receipts has dropped from $3 billion per month to nearly zero. And that's because under recovery is provided on 66 million liters of PMS. Now, the immediate past Minister of Petroleum says, and I quote, that as at 2017, Nigeria was consuming 29 million liters of PMS daily. So it's left for the government to provide you with empirical data on how that jumped from 29 to 66 million liters daily. The government cannot back it, which means that today, subsidy payments takes about 7 trillion Naira from the budget, as we speak today. In fact, the current standoff you have in PMS supply today in Nigeria that has caused scarcity across Nigeria is because of the difference between the official price and the price at which independent marketers get PMS at the depots in different parts of Nigeria. That's why you have scarcity all over the country. It doesn't have anything to do. I'm coming somewhere. The point here is this. You need to change your exchange rate mechanism because the basis on which we've operated this fixed model of plus or minus 3 Naira daily, which says that anything below or beyond 3 Naira daily, the central bank will come in to intervene, is on the premise that in 2014, we had the exchange rate at somewhere between 159, 162. In 2015, it moved to 181, 196. The difference was between 3 Naira to somewhere around, maybe at the high, it went about 14 Naira, okay? And then it precipitated interventions from the central bank based on the fixed exchange rate model. But you have a situation today where in 2019 it's moved from 307 to 365, is moved now to 445 to 745, 750. And for you to bring in liquidity to back your currency to prevent it from the slide that it's on, you need to be able to address the 4 major sources of funding for your FX markets in Nigeria. You need to address the issue of, in my opinion, unverifiable claims on the PMS subsidy or remove it entirely, number one. Number two, you need to realize that you cannot bring in FDIs and FPIs into Nigeria within the last 8 years. FPIs has dropped from about 30% to about 11% because the repatriation, capital and profit return from Nigeria. You need to address the issue of oil theft, right? If I saw in the policy document that they say that they want to increase daily production to about 2.6 million barrels per day, right? You need to address the issue of oil theft. You also need to pay attention to gas. I'm sure.
So Kelvin, let me come in here. In one word, this policy of reviewing and better optimizing the exchange rate, which is in existence at the moment, will not work.
It will not work if you cannot back it with liquidity, because FX is basically willing buyer, willing seller.
Okay, let's get Dr. Fasua's reaction to that. So
basically, the old thing about FX liquidity is valid, and we all understand that at the end of the day, it depends on the economic complexity of the goods and services the country sells. The challenge on ground now is that, like I said earlier, we are allowing the tail to wag the dog. The black market should not be wagging the official market. In terms of volume, what goes on in the official market is a lot larger than what goes on in the black market. Now, so sometimes the tail wags the dog, and it's an anomaly for that sector of the market, or that sector of the market, to be dictating the pace of what happens in the official market. So what do we do, for example, if politicians need dollars as bribe? Is central bank going to be able to, or are official markets going to be able to fulfill that obligation ever, given the fact that maybe if someone wants to collect a bribe, he doesn't want it in Naira and all of that, or illegal transactions as well? Are we ready to open the tap given our current circumstances? So I think that what they mean by optimizing the market is that, listen, we're going to have a big sit down to know exactly what's what and where are we going. Of course, given the fact that we probably are still also on the other side working hard to ensure that we promote exports and get in some good money. If you look at FRS's latest report, the non-oil sector gave more taxes, 59% of the revenue that we got in 2022, and that's a good thing, meaning that some of the policies of government is beginning to work. And so on the FX side, the same thing is going to be the case. So it's going to be easy. What I don't think that the candidate is promising is that from day one, we're going to get there and open the tap and remove the lead and collapse the market to the FX, to the black market level. Because we did this in 2016. We did it in 2016. Remember, in 2016, official rate was doing about 198. The black market was doing about 216. And at some point in time, there was that argument about, okay, crude oil prices are falling. What do we do? President Buhari was saying that he will never devalue. And then he went abroad. It was when Vice President Osinbajo took over briefly that they reached that rapprochement. But what they did was to, allow the official market to collapse to 306, 360. Perhaps the mistake would have been to have a single rate. Why have a 306 for official so-called uses, quote and unquote, and 360 for others? So that was one mistake. They didn't need to do that. Let me just land quickly. So, but however, what we found at the end of the day was that the black market also shifted to 500 and 550. And what have we been pursuing? The danger we face with the idea of total liberalization of that market is that we are going to be chasing, it will now be a case of the dog chasing its tail. So I made that analogy earlier on about the tail wagging the dog, but you're going to end up having the dog chasing its tail. We're never going to catch up with that black market. I call it black market. People call it, what's it called, parallel market. We don't have to spray perfume on that market. This is what it is. And some of the peculiarities of that market is because of the way our economy is and who we are at this point in time. And I think we have to also incorporate that psychology of where we are and who we are for now in the determination of the policies that we're going to use for that market and even other markets.
All right, incorporating that psychology of who we are. Sorry, Kelvin. Sorry, Kelvin. Let me just get Dr. Shitta's point on this. And yes, we can just get yours briefly, what you want to say. Please hold your thought. Yes, he said incorporating the psychology of who we are. So looking at this, it looks like the team has to go back on the drawing board, bring in new ideas on the table, because this will not work.
Okay, obviously, it's going to be a challenge. I like the expression psychology of who we are. Who are we? People are people all over the world. If there's an opportunity to take advantage of a market gap, people will take advantage. And I disagree with those who say, oh, it's a Nigerian thing. No, it's not. It's a human thing. Human beings will take advantage of where there is a gap, where there's an opportunity to profit. People will profit from it. It's basic economics, right? So I don't think there's a unique psychology of who we are. There's simply a psychology of optimizing market opportunities, and that's what we're seeing. And I think I agree with Kelvin. It's like I said earlier, it's a demand and supply thing. So we've got to take care of the liquidity, but we also need to take care of the structure of the Nigerian economy. Are we structured in such a manner to be able to generate the kind of foreign exchange we require? I mean, Kevin, I think it was, that was talking about FDI, that's foreign direct investment. In other countries, you take China, you take India, even during the heart of COVID-19, FDIs were on the ascendancy. In countries like Nigeria, they were on the decline. Why? What did those other countries do right that Nigeria didn't take advantage of? Don't forget, 2000, 2001, Nigeria, India, China, in FDI, we were virtually at the same level. The changes happened when both India and China realized that there was a need to open up their economy in such a manner that they will attract investment.
You have said it there, going back to the drawing board and looking at what we need to do differently, right? Kelvin, I see you were eager to give us a reaction there. I don't know if you're still there. Just make that reaction very briefly.
In response to Dr. Fasua about non-oil revenues, you know, if you look at the numbers, you see that oil is actually 10% of output for the revenue. I honestly think this whole debate about non-oil revenue is good, because Nigeria has a comparative advantage with oil and gas. And I'll tell you why I said so. See, for the 1.5 million barrels of crude oil that is drilled every day in Nigeria, we generate 9 billion cubic feet of gas. Nigeria's gas capacity utilization is 32% today. Nigeria has the capacity to generate up to 184,000 metric tons of LNG daily. 1 ton of LNG on the international markets is $150 US. If you look at the fact that between 1999 and 2015, the LNG as Nigerian Liquefied Natural Gas Company, an LNG, of which Nigerian federal government owns 49% equity, has generated $85 billion US and has paid the Nigerian government as dividend and taxes 35% of that $85 billion, which amounted to about $30 billion US. And that between 2012 and today, the NLNG has asked for FID. FID is basically like CAPEX to build new trains. And the Nigerian government has refused to provide its own part of the counterpart capital required to build Train 7, Train 8, and on and on. And if you consider the fact that each train has a capacity to generate up to $3 billion US for the Nigerian government in dividends and taxes, and the government has not done anything. The government couldn't take advantage of the fact that when Russia invaded Ukraine and there was the embargo on Russian oil and crude gas, that Western Europe needed gas, the UK, Germany, Netherlands, France. They needed gas, Poland, Finland. They went to Qatar. They went to the US. They went to Australia. Nigeria couldn't step up. So you have a situation today, for example, where Nigeria wastes about 60% of the gas it generates from the wellheads for drilling oil. It doesn't use it. So if we're talking about this argument, let us not say that, oh, pivoting and diversifying the economy from oil and gas is the way to go. I don't believe it's the way to go. It's the way to go on the long term, but on the short term, to meet up with your capital commitments, that has caused a situation, for example, and I'll tie it in, a situation, for example, where the federal government has had to rely on the Central Bank of Nigeria for ways and means. The abuse of the ways and means in Section 38 has cost-push inflation, and has caused currency devaluation, and has caused inflation to highs that we've not seen since 1996. By the way, I don't believe the official inflation number. I think the real inflation numbers are above 40%. Okay? You begin to see that the federal government has a revenue problem.
Now, looking at revenue issues, the government seems to have issues generating revenue, and is looking the APC government is a continuum, really. Already there's something on ground that the government is doing when it comes to this. But let me ask you straight off, is this workable with what the APC government says it wants to do?
Well, no. Let me be quite candid with this. Now, one of the things that I take to heart is a statement made by Albert Einstein that you cannot solve a problem at the same level of thinking that created the problem in the first place. You've got to change your thinking. You've got to rethink, re-strategize. That rethinking and re-strategizing is what I'm not seeing in the APC. We've tried this. We've tried those methodologies. They haven't worked. Dr. Fasua talked about securitization. So first and foremost, Section 38 of the CBN Act does not allow you to securitize ways and means. In other words, the government takes money from the central bank, spends the money, and then suddenly it says, you know what, we'll bundle all this money into a debt instrument and then sell it to you. Who are you selling it to? Mostly institutional investors, including pension funds.
Mind you, I wasn't talking of securitizing ways and means.
Okay.
Securitizing gas proceeds and so on.
Okay, great. So anyway, thank you for the clarification, Doctor. So, but we have seen the...
And Teslim, even if you securitize gas transactions, you have to securitize it under forward contract structure.
All right, guys, hold your thoughts. Hold your thoughts. Guys, we will continue this conversation. We will have to take a break at this moment. When we come back, this conversation on revenue generation and fiscal policies will be on the table of discussion. Glad to have you back on Nigeria Beyond 2023. I've been speaking with Mr. Teslim Shitta-bey with Proshare, Dr. Tope Fasua, who is a member of the All Progressives Congress Party 2023 Presidential Campaign Policy Team and Economist, as well as Kelvin Emmanuel, a public affairs analyst and CEO of Dairy Hills. Yes, before we went on that break, I asked you to hold your breath because it looked like there was a heated argument around revenue, around infrastructure financing and all of that. So let's get that your thoughts clearly now.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Dr. Fasua talks about securitization, and I explained what that was basically. It's converting some of these liabilities, or what we want to say is debt, and turning them into instruments that people can buy. So that's like, I'm owing you a lot of money, so you know what, let me push that money to you guys, and over time I'll pay you back. That's securitization in a nutshell. It's a little bit more complex, but in the basic, what we need to talk about now in Nigeria is financialization. Now, how does that differ from securitization? Now, financialization suggests that we get assets, public assets, for instance, and when we get these public assets, we try to establish the market value of these assets. And then we make these assets liquid by placing them on an exchange. And we saw an example of this with Saudi Aramco. The Saudi Arabian government said, you know what? We're going to sell 2% of Saudi, just 2% of Saudi Aramco. And let's see how things pan out. They went to the United States of America, listed the 2%, and the rest is history. Today, we saw how much came, and that's just a mere 2%. They financialized their public assets. That's what we're talking about. That generates a huge amount of inflow. You still own your assets. You're still the dominant owner of your assets, but you have financialized it such that it has a market value. So we all know how much Saudi Aramco is worth. That's the kind of thing we should be looking at. Now, one thing I want to say is this, before you interject, is this. Nigeria has so many thousands of idle public assets. How do we generate value from these assets and use it to take care of the problems we have in terms of revenue? Because the only thing we're looking at is the profit and loss account. Oh, revenue and cost. Our expenses. These are our expenses, these are our revenues. No. There's another side of the accounting equation, and that is the balance sheet. Can Nigeria leverage its balance sheet, its assets, to be able to generate the revenues that will take... See, Nigeria's budget is a small budget. Very small in dollar terms compared to the requirements of generating between 6 to 7% growth rate. We produce over 1 million students from tertiary institutions with an economy that is barely growing. We're doing 3% this year. We did 3.4% last year. We're going to do 3% this year. That's really doesn't get us too
Okay,
far.
Dr. Fasua, you may come in here now. He's saying we have a lot of public assets lying fallow, rather than these credit guarantees attracting private sector investment and all of that to create revenue that is needed to finance our troubles. I would use it that way. So what was your reaction earlier?
From what my reaction earlier was to quickly clarify that I wasn't talking about securitizing ways and means, and we know the peculiar issue with the ways and means. And however, I want to point Kelvin to study. I think I'm also still studying that anyway, but to study how they were able to manage exposures of the Bank of England to the UK economy, to the UK economy, so to speak, which could also be termed as ways and means, because every time every time the government of the UK issues bonds, the Bank of England seems to backstop it and to kind of underwrite it and to
it's actually called deals.
Well, okay, so in that way, so maybe we were unlucky, but we were also maybe we were lucky with the ways and means thing. Of course, it's an anomaly. There's 2,900 over the 2,900% over the what we ought to have taken. So I was just clarifying that one. That's a different ballgame entirely. What Teslim has said also is valid about Saudi Aramco, going down the equity lane, and I think he has echoed something that Professor Ayo Teriba has been talking about recently about looking at equity rather than debt. However, I've got a few issues with that. I was kind of going to do a rejoinder to Professor Teriba, but I decided to let it pass as things develop, because right now we are good at raising debt, and of course sometimes the market closes down on us, and of course we've raised quite a few Euro bonds which are at floating interest rates, and as interest rates go up around the world, it puts us into more trouble. Servicing those debts are an issue. So when we talk about, what Saudi Aramco has done is great, because a specific company goes out to sell a part of that equity and raise some good amounts of money, in the international market. That's a possibility. What Professor Teriba talks about is that we have so many assets that we should sell them off. You see, that's going to create a lot of, maybe sometimes cause some constitutional issues. People will ask, what gives you the right as a sitting government to sell out a permanent asset permanently to other people? And then I also begin to wonder, when people talk about selling, we incorporate sales of assets into our national budget. I wonder why we should be selling assets to spend immediately, except we can have a way of saying, listen, if we're selling any of those assets by way of equity, then of course, let's put it in a certain fund and ring fence that fund for a certain purpose, like Norway has done with his crude oil proceeds. So that's one. And however, the third aspect, and look, there may be several aspects also involved of what I spoke about, is that listen, and of course it wasn't actually my idea, it's actually Bola Tinubu's idea as proposed in the NESG meeting he had.
But Bola Tinubu is your candidate?
What?
I said Bola Tinubu is your candidate, and I want to believe you would agree with whatever he
I reckon he is anyway. So it was his idea, because he being an oil person, he actually said, listen, we can get deferred profit, we can strike deals and look at our deferred profit and actually discount it. So in a way also, whoever you're going to be discounting to is relying on future proceeds. And that's also another way of financial innovation, and indeed you call it securitization. So there are many options. However, let me quickly say this to target your specific concern about revenue. Well, there are two ways of looking at it. I would want a scenario where we get our revenue from a more robust and sustainable approach. There's still a lot of things that are fuzzy in Nigeria. We end up hemorrhaging revenue everywhere. So if you look at I mentioned FRS earlier on, their 2022 results was 10.1 trillion. Last year, the year before that, 2021, they made 6.4 trillion. Before that, they made 4.3 trillion. So, and the chairman of that FRS was saying that, look, they had a number of problems, including a lot of infighting. He actually did say that, that if those things hadn't been there, government agents suing government agent, at the end of the day, the revenues slip through all of them and all of that. And of course, with the deployment of IT, including AI, including big data, knowledge of big data, and all of that, we're looking at 10 trillion this last year. We are looking at 12 trillion this year. I think that we should be aiming at 20 trillion, and I think that we should be, organically generating our revenue from within. And there are so many things to explore. I know that many times the private sector tends to oppose any attempt, but even if there's no increases in tax, just enforcement, not taxation alone, everything that's due to government, including rent, rates, duties, fees, fines, and what have you, that is how countries are run. Rather than the reliance on assets that are in the ground. Nigeria also discovered the lithium in about 6 or 7 states now. We found lithium, and lithium is meant to be the next crude oil because we're talking about batteries and so on. But I'm suspicious that many of those powerful countries, they preserve their own resources and they come to Africa just to take these resources in the raw form. The current minister of soil minerals did stop them from just coming in. He asked them, Elon Musk's company, that they need to set up a factory here if they wanted lithium. And that's not the only one. We have crude oil in the Gombe axis, Gombe-Bauchi axis, already gone live. Another was discovered in Nasarawa. So we have a lot of those things in the ground. Right. We have tantalite, we have barite, and all of those things in very large quantity in this country. But that shouldn't be. That should be the government should find a way that the private sector will operate this in, and that's what we said, that we're going to create even a better enabling environment, a business-like approach, and a responsible governance, creating the corporate governance required to get those resources.
Thank you. I'm sure you were not talking about sale of assets at that point. Yeah. So, but let me bring you in, Kelvin, talking about generating our revenues internally. Dr. Fasua harped on that, and looking at tax waivers. Now, the APC government says it will review the existing tax waivers in the country, and this has come under a lot of criticism. I stated earlier about the Oxfam report talking about the widening gap between the rich and the poor. No, so now, do you think this is achievable? Will this work with this fiscal policy that the APC is putting on the table? Kelvin?
Well, I listened to Dr. Fasua talk about deferring profits. And I think that is not different from setting up forward contract structures. I think it's a bad idea. And I'll tell you why it's a bad idea. The whole talk of, oh, we did 4.3 trillion, we did 6.1 trillion, we did 10.1 trillion. And I gave you an example earlier when we started about what Nigeria could do with LNG. NNPC signed a JV with the National Oil and Gas Company of Morocco. That project financing is $25 billion US. FID for engineering, procurement, and construction requires that NNPC put up 50% of that. That's about $12.5 billion US. Okay. How will NNPC raise money? Teslim talked about financialization, right? And he gave the example of Saudi Aramco selling 5% equity.
2%.
The stock in an IPO. Question I have is, following Petroleum Industry Act, why don't you conduct business process reengineering and transformation of the NNPC, tidy the books of the NNPC, and float the NNPC as a public company, sell maybe 10, 15, or 20% of the NNPC to generate revenue that will focus on number one, setting up joint venture partnerships in midstream especially. Saudi Aramco owns a refinery in Texas called Motiva that does process about 600,000 barrels of crude oil into different derivatives like LRG, liquefied refinery gas, bitumen binders. It does Jet A1, it does PMS, it does AGO, and the rest of them. In fact, ExxonMobil just finished building a plant that processes petroleum products into, they call it, it's a chemical part of the business. They process polypropylene and polyethylene crystals, which is what Dangote also does, started doing last year, I think, in Lekki, and exports to South America and the US. See, the path for oil and gas, in my opinion, is the most viable path over the next 10 years for Nigeria to rebalance its finances and get off using debt as a means to cover budget deficits. It's the most viable path. You need a plan for how to move from doing OPEC benchmark monthly quotas. And this is the reason I say, look, the OPEC template is stale. Look at what Qatar did in 2019 and 2020. Look at where Qatar is today. Okay, the gas per capita income in Qatar is about $43,000 US. Okay, look at where Qatar is today with gas. The template where OPEC comes and says, okay, Nigeria, you have 1.8 million barrels per day, you have to meet up your quota, is stale. So if, for example, tomorrow Nigeria goes to 34 or 5 million barrels per day, Nigeria will not be able to achieve or maximize the potential because OPEC will restrict you on how much you can produce. NNPC needs to start thinking of how to convert its daily production into derivatives and exports to other African countries under the AFCFTA. Because if you look at that framework, for example, there's an exclusive list that's about 10%. Natural gas and crude oil falls under both the exclusive and the sensitive list. There's also an opening in Western Europe and Southeast Asia for Nigeria's crude oil derivatives, crude oil and natural gas, either as LPG or as LNG or as piped natural gas. Okay, so for me, the argument of non-oil revenues, it's good, but we have to understand that we have a comparative advantage with oil and gas, and we can't afford to, sidestep this potential we have, convert it into reality, and focus on other areas. And if you look at it very well, this government has placed a huge tax burden on the people. Businesses are growing, businesses are closing down. I'm not saying don't tax them, I'm saying don't increase the taxes. In the finance bill of 2022, the Minister of Finance proposed to raise the corporate income tax on upstream oil companies from 30 to 50% as a punitive measure for flaring gas. But then you go back and look at the Petroleum Industry Act and look at Associated Gas Reinjection Act that says that oil companies have the ambit to apply for gas flaring permits, right? If they are unable to find utilization and elimination uses for the gas that is being flared from wellheads. And you come back to the fact that you need to blame the federal government for not putting up capital in the 49% it has in LNG to be able to process the gas that comes out of wellheads into uses that brings in revenue for the joint venture partnership.
All right, Phil.
So in closing this argument, including this part of the argument, I need us to understand, think outside of the box, and realize that this whole drive of non-oil revenues is good. But what do we have comparative advantage with?
All right, what do we have comparative advantage with? Well, diversification, we'll say, is also very good. Just as he has said, non-oil revenue. And gentlemen, we have touched on so many points here: infrastructure financing, fiscal policy, monetary policy, oil and gas in a way, because these things intertwine. But let's look at one thing that affects many Nigerians, and that's talking about health, education. The average Nigerian is very worried about the state of health, education at the moment. Now, Dr. Fasua, I'm picking on health here. Your candidate says it's going to revamp Nigeria's primary healthcare system. Now, what is that thing that your candidate will be doing differently, looking at the reality on ground?
Before I talk about that, let me quickly just say that what we are proposing regarding issues of deferred profit, securitizing oil proceeds, gas proceeds, is an option. An option in addition to the idea of financialization, in addition to what Kelvin has also proposed. They say we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And we have to look at the entire universe of possibilities that we have as we're approaching these issues. And of course, we're also proposing tax efficiency, not increases in tax. In fact, Tinubu mentioned reducing taxes in that sector, not increasing taxes in that sector. If we see that as, already, in fact, he said, because I think it was Mr. Frank Aibogun of the Publisher of Business Day, who asked him and told him, listen, you know that the IOCs have left, their spirit has left Nigeria. What do we do? And he said, okay, they said they're going to Guyana. And he said, well, in going to Guyana, they have to build a lot of infrastructure, which we already have in Nigeria. Okay.
They already have the infrastructure. Exxon already has infrastructure in Guyana. They do about 900.
Okay, fine, given. Lastly, I want to attack the idea of comparative advantage. And I know that Kelvin won't find it very funny, but it is what it is. It's a dead idea. It's one of those ideas which we call zombie economics. It was an idea put together by David Ricardo in 1820. That's almost 300 years ago. And so it's dead. If you listen to people like Ricardo Hausman and a few other guys who are thinking now in economics, you realize that, look, the idea that a country should rest on its oars, believing that it has a comparative advantage is very suboptimal. And the current approach now is the mass attack. Everything you have to put your best 11 on the field at every point in time. So we have a great striker, which is crude oil, but sometimes your striker, your Ronaldo, may not deliver. That's the point. So whereas
Saudi Arabia will be more than $100 billion in revenue. Saudi Arabia will be more than $100 billion in revenue.
See, you're talking about how much in revenue, how many $1 billion. We're talking about exploding the economy. And this, Tinubu is the only one that
explode the economy without revenues.
Do you know that
revenues?
I can't hear you though. What did you say?
You can't explode the economy without revenues. Nigeria is
of course, that's the thing. But
I'll give you an example.
It's about imagination.
Quickly, I'll give you an example. Lebanon had what they call the Lebanon liquidity crisis.
Yeah.
Okay. The Lebanese government in 2020 was unable to pay back $2.5 billion in interest payments. And guess what? Out of the $143 billion that the Lebanese government owed, 43% came from ways and means lending. The Central Bank of Lebanon, otherwise known as Banque de Liban, borrowed the Lebanese government 43% of $143 billion in ways and means. And guess what? It's inflation and currency devaluation in Lebanon for the Lebanese pound spiraled.
That's
Nigeria is sinking in debt. Nigeria is sinking in debt. Dr. Fasua,
yeah.
OBJ left Nigeria at 2.4 trillion naira in 2007. President Buhari has taken it to 77 trillion. Nigeria is sinking in debt because it has a revenue to GDP ratio of 7.4%. If you want to explode this economy, you have to generate revenue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think we agree on that. The only thing we don't agree on is how. And I'm saying that, look, we can deploy our best assets in different ways and everybody can go get these revenues in. We can do what we have to do on crude oil.
Dr. Fasua, you're on the presidential campaign council. You're on the presidential campaign council. How are you going to generate the revenues?
Okay, Kelvin did not allow me to talk. He actually had into my time.
Let me
conclude. Let me conclude before you come in, madam. Let me conclude before you come in because he didn't allow me to speak. So basically to say that as in where we are, look, I mentioned lithium, I mentioned coltan, I mentioned barite, I mentioned all those things. Everything has to come on board. And one of the things, part of the idea of dislinking the budget from crude oil, which we have been amping on, which is also in the manifesto, is you see that the only assumption in our budget year on year is simply crude oil. The first assumption, the only assumption, this is how much crude oil we want to sell, this is how much you want to sell it at, QED, and everybody goes home. What happens to all the other assets that we have if it was that? And of course, what happens to also revenue efficiency? It's all part of it. But you mentioned health, and this is the real question for now. So basically, of course, the focus is on primary health because we have realized that, the real problem we have is that even primary simple cases of headache makes it to loot. Simple cases of tummy ache makes it to lawsuits. Which are supposed to be reference hospitals and teaching hospitals, and then everything collapses from there. Most of the primary healthcare centers are empty of people and all of that. So part of what they intend to do is also to incentivize people to work in those areas. We're going to be looking at employing health technicians who can assist, also pressing in many of our medical doctors, even in training, including nurses in training, to assist at that level, thereby creating employment for them at that level and putting some activity back into the rural areas where those health centers are resident. So it's also part of reversing the Japa syndrome and also the health tourism syndrome. It's all about getting very serious with that sector, given that, look, I mean, there will always be jobs in that sector. As much as a lot of our doctors have exited the country, we also have thousands, almost millions, still waiting for good employment in that sector. Right. We can look at it as a growth sector, and that's what we're talking about.
It's a sector, but these people would always leave the primary healthcare system to go to lawsuits with very minute cases just because the equipment, the infrastructure in the primary healthcare centers are not there. Now, he is saying this. Do you think what he has said or what his candidate will do with this healthcare system will work?
Let me put it like this. The politician,
very briefly, because of time.
Yeah, the politician is wired in his DNA to be enthusiastic. The analyst, pessimistic. Reality lies somewhere in between the two. That's how I put it. The best time we've had in terms of primary healthcare was under Professor Olikoye Ransom-Kuti. And
that's how many decades ago?
Yes, several decades ago. The man's of blessed memory. But the thing about it was, how do you provide resources to sustain rural treatment facilities? Dr. Fasua talked about the Japa syndrome. The Japa syndrome will not be reversed by this policy. That is for sure. It will go on because we have trained high-skilled manpower that is in high demand in other countries that are safer, physical protection of their lives, they can raise families, they're optimistic about their future. First, you've got to treat those fundamental things that are causing the migration out of the country. We haven't tackled the security issue very effectively. The relative incomes earned by doctors is still fairly poor. Then you have a situation where infrastructure, the equipment for those hospitals, the hospitals themselves are in many rural communities dilapidated. Many rural communities still depend on midwives, the old traditional midwives. Many of these hospitals don't have drugs. So it goes back to our fundamental issue of revenue. He said exploding revenue. That is the fundamental issue. It's what you could call root cause analysis. What are the fundamental challenges? We don't generate enough revenue to create that environment that will make healthcare sustainable. Sorry, before I close here.
There's the Abuja Declaration for the World Health Organization, 2010. I just wanted to address what you're saying.
So thank you very much for that, Kelvin. We've got to first and foremost deal with the basics. It's very esoteric to talk about we'll build this, we'll do that. How? Where will you get the money from? Where are the opportunities in those communities? What is the relationship between the community and government? Now, the shortest distance between the governed and the government, you know what it is? Trust. We have seen a magnificent trust deficit in recent times. People need to buy into an idea. Hope is not a method. We cannot hope. We've done hope before. It didn't work. Now it's bare knuckle hard work. And you start from revenue. We've got to be able to generate the revenue. Yes, you have a plan, but how does that plan get funded? How do you activate that plan? How do you translate the plan from paper to the city or the rural communities? Now, I have not seen that path. What is the gap? What do you require to provide one standard medical facility in 774 local governments across Nigeria? How much will be involved?
Okay,
how do you fund it?
Kelvin, he talked about revenue, that revenue is very important in improving or revamping the health sector in Nigeria, especially the primary health centers in Nigeria. But for me, is it about revenue? Because you even go into these health centers and you're not even seeing doctors on ground, or you have doctors that are not even doing their work, or they are not qualified.
In fact, Nigerian Association of Resident Doctors (NAD) said that in the last 3 years, over 2,000 Nigerian doctors have relocated abroad. The reality of the matter is that the health budget is abysmal. That's the reality. In 2010, the Nigerian government signed an accord, a pact, that they were going to raise the share of the budget allocation to health, to the budget, to 15%, which was what was famously called the Abuja Declaration, in line with World Health Organization standards. That has not been done. The health budget is under 8%. Education budget just went up from 5.3 to about 8.2% in the 2023 Appropriation Act. Even at that, the question is, for the 2023 Appropriation Act, how are they going to fund it? Because they're expecting to borrow $20 billion to fund the deficits in the budget. And just 3 days ago, or 2 days ago, Moody's downgraded Nigeria's sovereign rating from B3 for foreign currency issuer to CAA1. That's 3 steps to the bank. I expect that the yield on the government bonds is going to go above 20% on that. Okay? The country risk premium for Nigeria has gone up from about 990 basis points to about 1,620 basis points, or 16 points.
All right, Kelvin, we need to round up because of time.
How do you borrow money sustainably? Number one. Number two, how do you raise the non-oil revenues from 6.3%, or both the non-oil and oil revenues from 7.4% up to the emerging market standard of somewhere between 16 and 20%? That's the question. In line with what Teslim has said, that's the question.
All right.
Because it's wishful thinking for you to say that you're going to provide a budget and say you're going to spend money on so. Question is, how will you fund the expenditure?
The budget. Let me take that as your last word. Dr. Fasua, let me get your last word in reaction to all of this. Very briefly at that.
Well, I think, this for Nigeria, and I believe that I'm working with someone who has a vision, a great vision, and beyond the rhetorics. And of course, we mentioned the fact that we're trying to decouple the budget from just mere crude oil and gas, whereas we'll also human capital. To be said, I ran for president myself in 2019. Running a country is tough, it's crazy. Winning an election and all of that presidential system of government is tough to run. I just want to learn to say that, look, we're still writing history. Oftentimes, the way we talk and the way we speak about our country is sort of nihilistic, as if to say, look, it's the worst that can be. it's not the worst that can be. And from where we are to where we need to get to, we are the ones that will have to do the work. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we can get this done, all of us. Thank you very much.
Your last word, Mr. Teslim.
I want to thank Dr. Fasua, and I want to thank the APC for at least setting out some key points that are necessary in looking at our country. And I agree, Dr. Fasua, totally, that the narrative of the bad Nigeria is a hoax. Every country across the globe has its own unique challenges. Every country will continue to have unique challenges. But I'm saying that let us bring to the table thinking that is above the ordinary and the common. Then, especially thinking about revenue, then we have a chance.
All right. Creative thinking, I would say. Thank you so much, Mr. Teslim Shitta-bey, Economist with Proshare. Thank you. We appreciate your time. Thank you, Dr. Fasua. We sincerely appreciate your time on the program, as well as Kelvin Emmanuel. Thank you so much. We're glad to have you on Nigeria Beyond 2023. That was an interesting and insightful conversation on Nigeria Beyond 2023 we've just had. But just before we go, let's do a quick recap of the conversation. We were told that there is the need to deepen the revenue base of the country, create an enabling environment to attract more investment inflows into the economy, leverage oil and gas potentials as a comparative advantage to leapfrog the economy, and achieve full revenue diversification. Well, join us for another interesting conversation of this program as we continue to engage on socio-economic issues around the manifestos of political parties. I am Yemisi Lanre Idowu.